Estamos reunidos aquí en el Centro de Estudios de
Afternoon.
Hermenéutica, en esta
We
tarde
have
de
gathered
verano aquí en
in the
Argentina, que se
Hermeneutics
presentó
Center.
el
This
verano
is a
así, sin
summer
pedir mucho
afternoon
permiso.
in Argentina,
Y le damos la bienvenida
and
al
we
doctor
welcome you. We would
Louden,
like to welcome
que nos
Professor
va a ofrecer
Louden,
hoy
who is
su
going to
presentación con la cual
make a
cerramos
presentation with
este
which we are
enriquecedor
going to
ciclo
close
que
this very good
organizó, que
cycle that has
ideó
been
y que llevó
organized
adelante
and
Silvia Di
developed
Sanza aquí en el
by
Centro de
Silvia
Estudios
Di
de
Sanza
Hermenéutica.
here at the
Esta es la
Hermeneutics
novena reunión,
Studies
novena y
Center.
última
This is our ninth
de
and
este
last
ciclo, que
meeting
como ya
in the
sabrán
cycle
todas y
that,
todos
as
ustedes,
you
lo
surely
titulamos Tras las
know,
huellas
we
de
have
Kant.
called
Le
after
agradecemos,
Kant's
profesor
footprints.
Louden, en nombre
Okay.
del Centro
Professor
de Estudios de
Louden, we thank you
Hermenéutica,
so much.
en nombre de su
On behalf
director,
of
que es
our
el doctor
center,
Carlos Ruta, que hoy
its
por una
director,
cuestión
Carlos
personal no
Ruta,
pudo
who is unavailable
presentarse,
today
no
for some
puede
personal
compartir hoy
reason.
esta reunión.
He
Y
regrets not
Silvia,
to
por
be able to be
supuesto,
here
a toda tu
today.
labor,
And of course,
que
Silvia, we want to
esperamos que
thank
haya
you for your
resultado
hard work
de agrado y de
that we hope
enriquecedora
has
también, como
been
le resultó a
good
todas y todos los que se acercaron a estas 9
to you as it
reuniones
has
de
been
Tras las
to
huellas de
everybody
Kant.
else who joined us in these
Entonces,
9 meetings.
te doy la palabra y
Now
cuando
you
quieras
have the floor.
comenzamos. Gracias.
Whenever you're ready, we can
Muchas
start.
gracias, Laura.
Okay.
Thank you,
Por la
Laura,
presentación. Muchísimas
for your
gracias,
kind
Robert,
words.
por
Thank you,
aceptar,
Robert,
la
for
invitación
accepting the
de hablar
invitation
en el
to
Centro de Hermenéutica de la
talk
Universidad
in our
Nacional de San
center of the
Martín.
National University of San Martin.
Intercambiamos muchos mails
We have
mientras
exchanged
organizábamos la conferencia.
many emails while we're
Y-
organizing this
y bueno,
conference.
como te decía al comienzo, nos
And as I
conocimos
was
en el
telling you at the beginning,
multilateral Kant
we
en el
met
2013,
in the
creo, más o
Kant
menos.
multilateral meeting in
Y bueno, fue muy
2013,
interesante.
and it was very
Además,
interesting.
justamente esta idea, tuve la
The
posibilidad de leer tu
idea,
trabajo y
I
esta
had the
idea
opportunity to
de
read
la
your
ética
paper, and
impura
your
fue
idea
motivo
about
de
impure
discusión en el
ethics
último
has been
Congreso Kant
discussed in the
de
last
octubre,
Kant
de hace un mes
Congress. That
atrás.
was in October,
Así
1
que
month
muy
ago.
interesante. Muchas gracias
So we find
por
it
estar
very,
con
very
nosotros
interesting. Thank you
hoy
very much
y
for being
espero que
with
te
us
sientas muy
today.
cómodo.
We hope you will feel
Apreciamos
comfortable.
mucho tu presencia
We very much
y
appreciate your
bueno, te dejamos
presence.
la palabra para que vos
And you have the
comiences
floor.
con tu exposición.
Muchas gracias. Hola.
Thank you.
Sí, perfecto.
Por muchos años pasado, estaba un estudiante intercambio en Guatemala,
I was an exchange
pero
student in
ahora
Guatemala many
no
years
recuerdo
ago,
muchas palabras.
but I can't remember much.
So I will speak in English now.
Ya,
And
sí, sí, en inglés.
I hope you will be able to follow me. I know it's difficult sometimes to follow lectures in another language that one is not fluent in. I myself have experienced this many times. For instance, in Brazil, where I met Silvia years ago. Okay, so my piece is called Ricoeur's Debt to Kant's Ethics. Part 1, Introduction, Close Encounters. Although I am by no means an expert on Paul Ricoeur's philosophy, I welcome this opportunity to say a few words about his debt to Kant's ethics, in part because I studied briefly with Ricoeur when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago many years ago. I will retire from teaching at the end of this year. And in recent months, I have spent a fair amount of time looking back on the development of my own career. And when I reflect back on my graduate work in Chicago, I often wonder if my own subsequent efforts to present a more humanistic, less formalistic Kantian ethics in my book, Kant's Impure Ethics, as well as in other writings. So I wonder whether those efforts themselves owe a debt to my encounters with Ricoeur. During the late 1970s, when I was taking courses as a philosophy graduate student, on the University of Chicago campus. Ricoeur spent half of the year in Chicago and the other half in Paris. And in the winter term of 1977, I took a course on Kant's critique of judgment that Ricoeur co-taught with Ted Cohen. What I remember most about the course, and this was 45 years ago, was how different their lecture styles were, as well as their approaches to Kant's text, and how difficult it was for me to follow what Ricoeur was saying. I don't speak French, and he spoke English rather quietly with a heavy French accent. I thought I also took a second course from Ricoeur called Ideology and Utopia that started with Marx's early writings, which I was quite interested in at the time, and also included discussion of Saint-Simon, Fourier, Mannheim, Weber, Habermas, and several others. But here my memory has turned out to be a bit faulty. For when I dug out my graduate school transcript the other day in preparation for this talk, I could not find Ideology and Utopia listed anywhere. For a while, I thought that perhaps I had merely audited the course instead of taking it for credit, which would explain why the course doesn't appear on my transcript. However, in 1986, Ricoeur published a book entitled Lectures on Ideology and Utopia. And in the editor's introduction, we read that these lectures were first delivered at the University of Chicago in the fall of 1975. I began my graduate studies in the fall of 1975, and now I think that I must have sat in on these lectures, which were probably public lectures rather than a graduate course just for students, which I do remember his lectures on ideology and utopia had a much larger audience than the course I took on Kant's critique of judgment. And this would count as additional evidence for my hypothesis that these must have been public lectures rather than a course for students. But here as well, I remember that I had trouble following his heavily accented and hermeneutics inflected English. However, although I did take a course with and sat in on numerous lectures with Ricoeur, I was never a student of his in any serious sense, and nor am I a close reader of his published writings. But again, the present occasion to present an informal talk on Ricoeur's debt to Kant's ethics has led me to wonder if, despite the fact that I did not work closely with him when I was a graduate student in Chicago, my own attempts over the years to find and defend a more humanistic, less formalistic Kantian ethics do nevertheless owe a debt to my brief encounters with him as a student. I will return to this issue at the conclusion of my talk, and I apologize in advance if I seem to some of you to be inserting too much of myself into this lecture. In what follows, I will focus primarily on those aspects of Ricoeur's ethical theory that I believe track back to Kant. My primary text here is his 1992 book, Oneself as Another. I don't believe this book has been translated into Spanish, but some of you probably have read the English. Well, it was written in English. Anyway, and this book is a development of his 1986 Gifford lectures in Edinburgh. And I and many others view Oneself as Another as his central work in ethics. Section 2, an unusually Catholic philosopher. Nearly everyone who writes about Ricoeur's philosophy remarks at some point on the fact that all of his writings are informed by the history of philosophy, give careful credit to the authors he has read and by whom he has been influenced, and exemplify a generosity of spirit to philosophical mentors and opponents alike. In his style is evident a search for dialogue between views that are generally taken to be opposites. Another commentator puts it a little more succinctly by saying that Ricoeur is the exponent of the both and the opponent of the either or. Although Kant looms large in the pantheon of Western philosophers Ricoeur refers to in his writings on ethics, the sage of Königsberg is by no means the only author referred to. And it would be a fundamental error to describe Ricoeur's approach to ethics as Kantian without serious qualification. For instance, adopting a term of Eric Weil's, Ricoeur in several earlier writings refers to himself as a post-Hegelian Kantian. What Weil essentially meant by this term, post-Hegelian Kantian, as another commentator, Robert Piercy, notes, is the attempt to reconcile how the universal and essential features of human experience, these would be the Kantian features, might be reconciled with the concrete and historical or Hegelian features. Weil calls himself a Kantian and not a Hegelian because he privileges the universal side, seeing it as more fundamental than the historical. But Weil's Kantianism is post-Hegelian in its insistence that the universal only has meaning in its concrete historical instantiations, and in its claim that studying these instantiations is a properly philosophical task. Although Ricoeur essentially follows Weil's usage of the term post-Hegelian Kantian, Ricoeur, does not follow Weil in calling himself a Kantian. Rather, Ricoeur tries to keep Kant and Hegel in a kind of competitive equilibrium with each other. As he puts it in an essay called Freedom in the Light of Hope, which is in his book, The Conflict of Interpretations, quote, something of Hegel has vanquished something of Kant, but something of Kant has vanquished something of Hegel, because we are as radically post-Hegelian as we are post-Kantians. At any rate, in my judgment, the term post-Hegelian Kantian is not an entirely accurate description of the position advocated by Ricoeur in his later work, Oneself as Another, for the simple reason that in this text, Aristotle plays a larger role than Hegel. One could, I suppose, call Oneself as Another post-Hegelian Kantian Aristotelian in its orientation, but this term is too big a mouthful for my taste. Granted, in Oneself as Another, Ricoeur echoes Hegel's famous distinction between Sittlichkeit, the concrete ethics of one's community, and Moralität, Kantian universal morality, when he writes, quote, I reserve the term ethics for the aim of an accomplished life and the term morality for the articulation of this aim in norms characterized at once by the claim to universality and by the effect of constraint. But here, Ricoeur is clearly interpreting ethics in a more Aristotelian than Hegelian vein, as he indicates in the following passage. It is easy to recognize in the distinction between aim and norm the opposition between two heritages, an Aristotelian heritage where ethics is characterized by its teleological perspective, and a Kantian heritage where morality is defined by the obligation to respect the norm, hence by a deontological point of view. So to hopefully avoid future confusion, when I use the term ethics in here, this usually refers to the Aristotelian perspective on ethics. And the term morality in turn refers to a Kantian position. And this is the way Ricoeur is using these terms in his book. All right, and Ricoeur continues in the very next sentence to offer 3 propositions that remain guideposts for his entire study. And these propositions themselves play Aristotle off against Kant. All right, so quote, I propose to establish, without concerning myself about Aristotelian or Kantian orthodoxy, although not without paying close attention to the founding texts of these 2 traditions. First, the primacy of ethics over morality. Second, the necessity for the ethical aim to pass through the sieve of the norm. And third, 3, the legitimacy of recourse by the norm to the aim wherever the norm leads to impasses in practice. In other words, according to the working hypothesis I am proposing, morality, and again, that's the Kantian heritage, is held to constitute only a limited, although legitimate and even indispensable actualization of the ethical aim, that would be the Aristotelian heritage. And ethics in this sense would then encompass morality. There will thus be no attempt to substitute Kant for Aristotle. Instead, I shall establish a relation involving at once subordination and complementarity, where the final recourse of morality to ethics will ultimately come, or which the final recourse of morality to ethics will ultimately come to reinforce. All right, so a couple comments on those 3 propositions. In plugging for the primacy of ethics over morality, which was in the first proposition, it looks at first as though Aristotle wins and that Ricoeur's debt to Kant is rather minimal. But it's not quite this simple. For again, the second proposition defended in his book is that ethics must pass through the sieve of the moral norm. And that too is the Kantian heritage. And in the third proposition, he states that morality, the Kantian heritage, is an indispensable actualization of the ethical or Aristotelian aim. And later in Oneself as Another, Ricoeur states explicitly that his manner of referring morality back to ethics, as expressed in the third basic proposition, quote, is not to be taken to mean that the morality of obligation has been disavowed. Simply put, the position defended by Ricoeur in Oneself as Another is that the inclusion of Kantian morality is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the ethical vision that he himself, Ricoeur, is advocating. All right, and then part 3, the claim to universality. As is perhaps already evident, Ricoeur's primary debt to Kant's ethics lies in his emphasis on the need for universal norms in any satisfactory ethical theory. But there are several qualifications or reservations that he adds to the familiar and broad theme of Kantian universality. First, although it's clear that Ricoeur is committed to the need for universal norms in ethics, it is not so much the bare feature of universality that he finds valuable in the Kantian deontological tradition as the related features of constraint and duty. As he remarks in Oneself as Another, we have entered the Kantian problematic through the royal gate of universality. This problematic by itself, however, is not enough to characterize a morality of obligation. Inextricably tied to the idea of universality is the idea of constraint, characteristic of duty. And this is so by reason of the limitations that characterize a finite will. To put this in more Kantian language, morality confronts human beings, that is, finite rational beings who, because of their countervailing inclinations, do not always act according to reason, as a massive system of imperatives or oughts. Due to our biological nature, we can never escape from these imperatives or oughts. So our relationship as humans to morality is always one of constraint. Whereas, as he remarks in the groundwork, no imperatives hold for the divine will, and in general for a holy will. The ought is out of place here because volition of itself is necessarily in accord with the moral law. So on Kant's view, different kinds of rational beings have different kinds of relationships to morality. At one point, Ricoeur refers to Kantian morality as, quote, a means of testing our illusions about ourselves. And perhaps our biggest self-illusion is that we simply don't need constraints. Second, and here I see a strong affinity with contemporary Kantians, such as Alan Wood, Ricoeur has a decided preference for the second formula of the moral law, the formula of humanity as an end in itself. As he remarks tersely in a footnote, the categorical imperative by which I must treat humanity in my own person and in that of others as an end in itself and not simply as a means. This privileging of the second formula over the others is, of course, a break with Kantian orthodoxy, for in Kant's own comparison of the different formulas of the categorical imperative, he states explicitly that one does better always to proceed in moral appraisal by the strict method and put at its basis the universal formula of the categorical imperative, act in accordance with a maxim that can at the same time make itself a universal law. So Kant recommends that people use the first formula. He calls that the strict method. But this strategy of privileging the second formula over the first is an increasingly popular one at present. And I think it's one that Kant himself sees the rationale for. In his discussion of the different formulas, he also says it's good to bring an idea of reason closer to intuition and thereby to feeling. When I discuss the different formulas of the imperative with students, I always find that the second one, the humanity as an end in itself formula, that one registers much more solidly with them than the universal law formula, which many of them find a bit difficult to get a handle on. All right, third, and related to the previous point about the privileging of the second formula, Ricoeur sees a strong affinity between the golden rule and the second formula of Kant's categorical imperative. And he comments on this affinity at several points in his book. For instance, quote, "We shall interpret the golden rule as the transitional structure between solicitude and the categorical imperative by which I must treat humanity in my own person and in that of others as end in itself and not simply as means." And here's a second quote. "It is the golden rule that seems to us to constitute the appropriate transitional formula between solicitude and the second Kantian imperative." And thirdly, and I think this one is the most telling comment on this issue, it seems opportune to base our discussion on the golden rule, as it represents the simplest formula that can serve as a transition between solicitude and the second Kantian imperative. By placing the golden rule in this intermediary position, we allow ourselves the possibility of treating the Kantian imperative as the formalization of the golden rule. So particularly at the end there, he's essentially saying, I'm going to treat Kant's imperative, by which he, again, mostly means this second formula, the end in itself formula, as itself the formalization of the golden rule. All right, but Kant, alas, does not treat the categorical imperative as the formalization of the golden rule. In a footnote to the groundwork, he writes, "Let it not be thought that the trivial," and then he writes in Latin, which I don't really speak, "what you do not want to others to do to you, etc., can serve as the benchmark or principle here. For it is, though with various limitations, just derived from the latter. It can be no universal law, for it does not contain the ground of duties to oneself, nor of duties of love to others. For many a man would gladly agree that others should not benefit him, if only he might be exempt from showing them beneficence, and finally not of duties owed to one another. For the criminal would argue on this ground against the judges who punish him, and so on." He has a lot packed in there, and this is not the place for an analysis and assessment of Kant's criticisms of the golden rule. I would simply like to say here that I side with Ricoeur on this specific issue. Both Ricoeur and I believe that there is a strong affinity between the golden rule and the categorical imperative. And I think that perhaps it was partly Kant's philosophical pride that led him to cast the golden rule in such a negative light. In an early work of mine, Morality and Moral Theory, a Reappraisal and Reaffirmation, this one here, I remarked, Kant announces repeatedly in his ethical writings that the principles he puts forward and the justifications he offers on their behalves are reached through a descriptive analysis of what common human reason, or what he calls gemeine Menschenvernunft, holds to be true. Acknowledging the similarities between the golden rule and the categorical imperative is a prime example of how we can, as he puts it elsewhere in the groundwork, within the moral cognition of gemeine Menschenvernunft, at its principle, we can arrive at this principle without in the least teaching it anything new. All right, and then in this next part, part 4, the fact of morality, I'm going to add a little bit more to this issue of common human reason, or gemeine Menschenvernunft. An additional debt to Kant's ethics in oneself as another that warrants comment is Ricoeur's conviction that the proper starting point of moral theory is the description and analysis of ordinary moral beliefs. As noted above, one seldom noticed feature of Kantian ethics is its methodological commitment to starting with a descriptive analysis of ordinary people's moral beliefs, or what he calls gemeine Menschenvernunft. The moral theorist's job is not to invent a new moral principle and then try to convince people to accept it, but rather to clarify and reflect on how ordinary, conscientious moral agents actually deliberate about moral issues. As Kant remarks in a footnote in the second critique, the critique of practical reason. Who would even want to introduce a new principle of all morality and, as it were, first invent it, just as if before him the world had been ignorant of what duty is or in thoroughgoing error about it? Similarly, when the preliminary version of the universal law formula of the categorical imperative is first presented in the groundwork, Kant states, gemeine Menschenvernunft in its practical judging is actually in perfect agreement with this and always has this envisaged principle before its eyes. So yeah, he's not claiming that the categorical imperative is a new principle. He's claiming rather that it's already present within ordinary human moral consciousness, but in many cases somewhat obliquely and unclearly. And he sees his job as a philosopher to make it clearer and then to offer a justification why this principle and not some other principle. I suggested earlier that this important strand in Kant's ethical thought can be used to support the claim, contrary to what Kant himself asserts, that the categorical imperative is, as Ricoeur holds, a formalization of the golden rule. I mean, we find versions of this golden rule idea in literally every human culture, sometimes going back thousands and thousands of years. It's part of gemeine Menschenvernunft. But now I wish to make two additional points regarding it. First, Ricoeur follows Kant in holding that the task of moral theory is not to invent a new principle, but rather to carefully analyze human moral experience. As he states in a footnote, as in Aristotle, moral philosophy in Kant does not begin from nothing. The task is not to invent morality, but to extract the sense of the fact of morality. Second, even though Ricoeur sees a strong difference in content between Aristotle's teleological ethics and Kant's deontological morality, he holds that neither philosopher seeks to invent a new moral principle, but rather both seek to extract moral principles from our lived moral experience. I agree. As I argue in my first book, Morality and Moral Theory, Aristotle's method of ethics begins with a sorting through of the intuitions and beliefs people already have about the subject at hand, combined with an attempt to preserve the beliefs that are internally consistent. As he states in his Nicomachean Ethics, we must, as in all other cases, set down the appearances, ta phenomena, and after first working through the puzzles, go on to prove, if possible, the truth of all of the common beliefs, panta, ta, and doxa, about these experiences, or, if this is not possible, of the greatest number and the most authoritative. For we both resolve if we both resolve the difficulties and leave the endoxa undisturbed, we will have proved the case sufficiently. So yeah, Aristotle's method is very similar to Kant. It's not exactly the same. Aristotle starts with what he calls the endoxa, common beliefs about moral issues, and he analyzes them. If he believes they're all consistent with one another, then he says, okay, job done. If they're not consistent with each other, then he tries to figure out which ones to cast aside in order to reach a consistent position. All right, part 4, expenditures or more debts. However, there are also several key positions advocated in oneself and another, as another, that Ricoeur and many other theorists see as un-Kantian, but that I myself believe actually constitute important aspects of Kant's moral theory. The first is moral conflict. Ricoeur, like many other contemporary philosophers, accepts as a given what he calls the unavoidable nature of conflict in moral life. However, Ricoeur's position on this topic is complicated by the fact that he also charges Kantian moral theory with itself generating internal conflicts. Irresolvable moral conflict is thus both a fact of human life, according to Ricoeur, and this is an assumption that Kant is often interpreted as denying, and I'm going to return to that in a minute. But Kantian moral theory, or so Ricoeur alleges, itself produces conflicts. As Fred Dahlmeier notes in an essay he wrote on Ricoeur, in Ricoeur's account, the different formulations of the categorical imperative give rise to quandaries. Kantian deontological morality cannot stand on its own or have the last word by virtue of its intrinsic dilemmas or limitations. The claim that Kantian morality or Kantian moral theory itself generates conflicts is first flagged in Ricoeur's third basic proposition, which I discussed briefly earlier, when he states that, quote, the Kantian norm leads to impasses in practice. And it is repeated later in the book when he alludes to, quote, the conflicts that Kantian morality produces. Ricoeur's allegation that Kant's categorical imperative contains intrinsic dilemmas, contains multiple complex threads, and I will not investigate it further at present. But I do wish to briefly discuss the more fundamental issue of whether irresolvable conflict is part of human moral life. For at bottom, I think the primary reason why Ricoeur, like others, holds Kantian moral theory to be an insufficient guide to moral life is that it fails to recognize the reality of moral conflict. Yeah, I maybe overstated that. I wouldn't say the primary reason, but it's definitely one reason, okay? In a frequently commented on passage in his Metaphysics of Morals, this is now not the groundwork, but the later 1797 work, Kant explicitly states that, quote, a collision of duties and obligations is inconceivable, nicht denkbar. And then he adds in Latin, obligations do not conflict. Given the bluntness of this assertion, it should come as no surprise that he is often read as denying the very possibility of conflicts of duty, and hence also denying the reality of irresolvable conflict in moral life. However, I argued earlier in my first book, Morality and Moral Theory, that Kant does indeed recognize the reality of irresolvable moral conflict. And this is still my position at present. My argument was based in part on Kant's acknowledgement that there can be conflicting grounds of obligation. Here's a quote. He says, there can, however, be two grounds of obligation in one subject and in the rule he lays down for himself. This concession on Kant's part might at first seem to open the door to the reality of moral conflict, but he also seems to quickly close it when he adds that, quote, when two such grounds conflict with each other, practical philosophy says that the stronger ground of obligation holds the field. Or he also adds in Latin, the stronger ground of obligation wins. Many critics interpret Kant's remark about the stronger ground of obligation holding the field to mean simply that the weaker ground quits the field. It no longer exerts any claim at all. This is the way Martha Nussbaum puts it. The result being, as another commentator puts it, that there was only one actual obligation all along. However, or so I argue, this interpretation ignores the fact of agent regret. When moral agents are in situations where they must choose between two grounds of obligation, the weaker one does not simply disappear after the stronger one is pursued. Rather, people will normally regret the fact that they were unable to also carry out the weaker one, and they may try to rectify this situation in the future. Overridden oughts frequently do continue to exert moral force on us even after they are overridden, and they may still require our attention in the future. As Barbara Herman remarks, if the moral feature remains, it may still require attention, not as a residue, but as a moral feature of the circumstances in which the agent now stands. So, if I cannot at once help and tell the truth, a judgment that truth-telling is required does not free me from a requirement to help, if it is still possible to do that, or to do something else, explain myself, say, if the time to help is past. Kant himself refers to a type of moral conflict in one of the casuistical questions that he raises in the Doctrine of Virtue, the second half of the Metaphysics of Morals, when he invites readers to consider whether in certain circumstances there exists, quote, a permissive law of morally practical reason, which in the collision of its determining grounds makes permissible something that is in itself not permitted in order to prevent a still greater violation. Sometimes moral agents, even Kantian moral agents, are faced with moral conflicts where they must choose the lesser of two evils. Not to do so, Kant adds, this is also a quote from the Tugendlehre, not to do so would be an objectionable purism, a pedantry regarding the fulfillment of duty. Despite Kant's occasional confidence that the power of the categorical imperative is so great that it, quote, always determines quite precisely what is to be done and keeps one from missing it. That's in a footnote to the Critique of Practical Reason. A moment's reflection will show that this is not, in fact, always the case. Imagine a Sophie's choice situation where a mother is ordered by a Nazi commandant to choose which of her two children to send to the gas chambers. This is a famous example in William Styron's novel, Sophie's Choice. Neither the maxim, send the first child, nor the maxim, send the second child, can be willed to be a universal law. And neither maxim respects other humans as ends in themselves rather than means. In short, even Kantians must acknowledge genuine moral dilemmas and accept the reality of what Ricoeur calls the unavoidable nature of moral conflict in life. A second key position advocated by Ricoeur that he finds un-Kantian, but which I myself believe occupies a fundamental place within Kant's moral theory, concerns the necessary role of judgment in moral life. In Ricoeur's case, the necessity for judgment arises in part from what he believes are conflicts generated by the categorical imperative itself. As Dahlmeier notes, as announced in Ricoeur's third basic proposition, Kantian deontological morality cannot stand on its own or have the last word. By virtue of its intrinsic dilemmas or limitations, moral reflection is prompted to return to moral judgment in situation or practical wisdom. Those are both terms that Ricoeur uses in his book. The only way to mitigate or mediate these conflicts is through the cultivation of practical wisdom nurtured by tragic wisdom. Yeah, Ricoeur also argues that tragedies say something unique about the unavoidable nature of conflict in moral life. And that's also similar to Martha Nussbaum's position, for whatever that's worth. Both authors think that we often gain more insight about the tragic dimension of moral life through fiction, specifically tragedies, than we do through philosophical theories. Ricoeur's primary source of aid in elucidating the necessity of judgment in morality comes from Aristotle's well-known doctrine of phronesis, usually translated in English as practical wisdom. I'm not sure what the Spanish term is. As Dahlmeier observes, on the level of general ethical theory, the text, oneself as another, juxtaposes an Aristotelian ethics of virtue to a Kantian deontological theory, presenting both as necessary stepping stones to phronesis. However, Hegel's conception of Sittlichkeit also plays an important secondary role at this point. As Ricoeur states later in Oneself as Another, quote, "The practical wisdom we are seeking aims at reconciling Aristotle's phronesis by way of Kant's Moralität with Hegel's Sittlichkeit." Well, remember again, he's a philosopher of both and not either or. Reduced to modesty, Sittlichkeit now joins phronesis in moral judgment and situation. Concerning the practical wisdom suited to moral judgment and situation, one can say that Sittlichkeit repeats phronesis here to the extent that Sittlichkeit mediates phronesis. For Aristotle, phronesis involves an experientially learned capacity to see what ought to be done in particular situations where matters cannot be correctly decided merely by general principles. As he states in the Nicomachean Ethics, phronesis is concerned with the ultimate particular fact, since the thing to be done is of this nature. And it is the object not of scientific knowledge, or what he calls episteme, but of perception, aesthesis. Yeah, there's another famous passage, I think at the end of book 2 of the Ethics, where he says, ultimately, the decision lies with aesthesis. You know, general principles can help you a lot, but not always. And ultimately, the decision comes down to aesthesis, to perception. But what Ricoeur and other fans of Aristotelian phronesis fail to realize is that Kant's frequent discussions of the power of judgment, what he calls Urteilskraft, contain exactly these same points. A few examples. So these are all quotes from Kant's writings. Urteilskraft cannot be instructed, but only practiced. That is why its growth is called maturity, and its understanding that which comes only with years. Yeah, there's another passage that I have in a footnote from the Ethics where Aristotle says, it is thought that a young man of practical wisdom cannot be found because young people don't yet have the experience that both Aristotle and Kant are arguing is necessary to acquire judgment. All right, and then to go back to the Kant quote, I hope I'm not losing too many of you here. Therefore, if there were to be doctrines for Urteilskraft, then there would have to be general rules according to which someone could decide whether something was an instance of the rule or not, which would generate a further inquiry on into infinity. Thus, Urteilskraft is, as we say, the understanding that comes only with years. It is based on one's long experience. That's a quote from Kant's Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, which is one of the Kantian texts that I've translated into English. All right, and here a shorter quote from the Critique of Pure Reason. This is probably the most famous remark he makes on judgment. Urteilskraft is a peculiar talent which can be practiced only and cannot be taught. You can't learn it in school. It is the specific quality of so-called mother wit, and its lack no school can make good. Yeah, when I try to explain this to students, I often say phronesis is a kind of street smarts rather than book smarts. I don't know if you have that distinction in Spanish, but probably. All right, and here's a quote from the Groundwork, the most frequently read text of his in ethics. Moral laws, no doubt, still require Urteilskraft sharpened by experience, partly to distinguish in what cases they are applicable, and partly to provide them with access to the will of the human being and efficacy for his fulfillment of them. And a shorter quote from the later Metaphysics of Morals. Ethics inevitably leads to questions that call upon Urteilskraft. And then lastly, a quote from one of his anthropology lectures. This is also a text of his that I've translated into English for the Cambridge edition of Kant. Nothing is more laughable than when one shows no power of discrimination and does not see what is fitting to the circumstances. In short, one does not need to leave Kant and turn to Aristotle to find a robust theory of the need for practical judgment in ethics. It is a central part of Kantian moral theory. All right, and then conclusion. Part 5, sticking with Kant. At the conclusion of my introduction, I raised the question of whether my own ongoing effort, I started pretty much with the Kant's Impure Ethics, but I have several other books where I continue this effort. This one here, Kant's Human Being, essays on his theory of human nature. And then just last year, I published a short little book for what's called the Elements series with Cambridge University Press, Kant's Anthropology, or actually the real title is supposed to be Anthropology from a Kantian point of view. All right, anyway, I raised earlier the question of whether my own ongoing efforts to find and defend a more humanistic, less formalistic Kantian ethics itself owes a debt to my encounters with Ricoeur when I was a graduate student in Chicago, muchos años pasado, many years ago. The answer, which probably comes as no surprise, I've hinted at it already, is yes. Sí. Ricoeur and I have both, albeit in somewhat different ways. I mean, yeah, as you can probably tell by now, I am not a hermeneuticist. I have my also Catholic tastes in philosophy, but on the whole, I would say I have been more influenced by the analytic tradition, which tends to be stronger in English-speaking countries than does the hermeneutic tradition. So we've both, albeit in somewhat different ways, sought to defend a more realistic and less abstract ethical theory that, while recognizing the necessity of Kantian universal norms of justice for any minimally satisfactory moral outlook, also interprets Kantian ethics, Kant's own protestations to the contrary, as a modern development of the classical golden rule tradition. Thirdly, recognizes the brute fact of irresolvable moral conflict in human moral life. Fourthly, acknowledges that general principles alone cannot answer every moral question, and that judgment concerning particular circumstances is also needed. And fifthly, insists that the job of moral theorists is not to invent new principles, but to carefully analyze and reflect on the nature of ordinary moral beliefs. But whereas Ricoeur held that this conception of ethical theory could only be achieved by supplementing Kant with Aristotle and Hegel, much of my own work has been an attempt to convince people to broaden their reading in Kant's extensive corpus to include his more empirical, or what I call impure, writings on human nature, especially, but not only, his anthropology. By doing so, I have argued, we will finally arrive at an accurate picture of the practical philosophy that he himself advocated, but that has been virtually ignored by generations of philosophers who are obsessed with, and here I'm borrowing from Richard Rorty, keeping philosophy pure. Kant himself was adamant that the pure ethics by which most philosophers know him is only the first part of ethics. A second impure part is also necessary. As he states in one of his ethics lectures, the metaphysics of morals is only the first part of morals. The second part is moral anthropology, to which the empirical principles belong. Moral anthropology is morals that are applied to human beings. The metaphysics of morals, he also uses the Latin term, moralia pura, is built on necessary laws. Therefore, it cannot ground itself on the particular constitution of the human being, because then it wouldn't apply to other rational beings. The particular constitution of the human being, as well as the laws that are grounded on it, appear in moral anthropology under the name of ethics. Yeah, as I remarked in a footnote earlier, usually Kant treats Moralität and Sittlichkeit as synonyms. Unlike Hegel and others, say Bernard Williams, he doesn't differentiate between these terms morality and ethics. But this quote's interesting in part because he says morality, we use the word ethics to refer to moral anthropology. Although, just for the record, it's not the German term Sittlichkeit, which is how people usually translate Hegel's term. It's just ethic, like our English ethics. Anyway, that's a little minor translation point. It's not even necessary to resort to a classroom lecture to find the core of this message. Kant says it plainly enough in the groundwork. Quote, morals needs anthropology for its application to human beings. And in the later Metaphysics of Morals from 1797, quote, a metaphysics of morals cannot dispense with principles of application, and we shall often have to take as our object the particular nature of human beings, which is cognized only by experience. The counterpart of a metaphysics of morals, the other member of the division of practical philosophy as a whole, would be moral anthropology. It cannot be dispensed with. But while Kant asserted repeatedly that morals cannot subsist without anthropology, that's a quote from another ethics lecture, I believe the primary reason critics, even sympathetic ones such as Ricoeur, who feel forced at some point to go outside Kant's ethical theory due to its alleged empty formalism and abstract universality, these were Hegel's main charges in the philosophy of right against Kant. Or, as Bernard Williams puts it more recently, its infatuation with a purist view of morality, which rejects both a biological perspective as well as any reasonable historical and psychological understanding of morality, is that they're simply not familiar with Kant's anthropological works and his wider body of works on human nature. But if indeed, as he says in the opening sentence of one of his anthropology lectures, quote, There is no greater or more important investigation for human beings than knowledge of the human being, unquote. And this is a view that not only Kant held, but many Enlightenment theorists. There is what we often call an anthropological turn in the Enlightenment. Hume is part of this, Rousseau, Hutcheson, many thinkers. If that's true, then it is high time for moral philosophers to finally start paying more attention to Kant's anthropology. Muchas gracias. I'm sorry if I went on a little too long.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much,
Robert, por tu exposición.
Robert, for your
Excelente,
presentation, for your excellent
brillante, y nos has
excellent
dado
presentation. It has
muchísimo
been
para
actually
pensar.
brilliant, and you've given
Así
us a lot of food
que,
for thought.
bueno, vamos a
So,
poder abrir el diálogo con
with that,
vos
we're now
a
going to
partir de
open
las ideas
the
que nos
floor
presentaste.
as
Yo
of the
quería
ideas that you've
disculparme
exposed, and I would
porque
like
en el
to
entusiasmo
apologize
inicial
because
no
in my
presenté,
initial thrill, I did not
formalmente,
actually
entonces
introduce you
puse en el
formally.
chat,
So I
algunos
included in the
datos de
chat
tu
box some
biografía académica
information on your
que, bueno,
academic
los
background
podemos leer, pero
and
quedó
experience
más
that we can, of
que
course,
claro y
read, but
fundamentado tu
I believe it has
especialización
been
en la ética,
more
los
than
estudios
clear
éticos
that you are
antiguos,
an expert in
clásicos
ethics
y modernos también.
and also in modern
Pero
and old
antes de entrar en el diálogo,
studies
entonces me
in all
gustaría
everything related
señalar
to
esto,
this
unos
philosophy
datos de
and
tu
morality. But I would like
biografía,
to
digamos.
pinpoint some
Ya que, como
aspects of
señalabas,
your
estás haciendo
bio,
una revisión de toda tu
since
historia
you mentioned
académica.
that
Yo voy a
you've
decir apenitas algunos
I
rasgos.
just want to mention some traits
Robert Louden
of
es
all
doctor en
of your
filosofía por la
experience.
Universidad de Chicago,
Dr.
Estados
Louden holds a
Unidos, y
PhD
profesor
from
de
the
la
University of
Universidad del Sur de
Chicago,
Maine, en
United
Estados
States, professor
Unidos,
at the University of
miembro
Southern
de la
Maine,
Junta
US.
Directiva de la
He is also a member of
North
the board
American
of directors of
Society,
the North
se
American Cancer
especializa en
Society.
ética,
He
historia de la
specializes in
ética,
ethics and the
antigua y
history
del
of
siglo
ethics,
XVIII,
ancient
XIX y
and
XX,
that of
especialmente en
the
Kant,
18th and
con foco
20th
en la
centuries,
filosofía práctica
especially
y
in
la
Kant, with a focus
antropología,
on
como nos has
practical
mostrado.
philosophy and anthropology, as you have
En
well
historia de
showed
la
us.
filosofía moderna
And
y
in
de
the
la
history of modern
Ilustración,
philosophy
fue
and the
profesor
Enlightenment,
visitante de la Martin
he
Luther
was a visiting
Universität
professor at the Martin Luther
Halle-Wittenberg, de la
Universität
Universidad de
Halle-Wittenberg,
Göttingen
the
y de
University
la
of
Universidad
Göttingen,
Federal de
Germany,
Santa
and the Federal
Catarina,
University
Brasil.
of Santa
Ha
Catarina,
recibido
Brazil.
premios de la Fulbright
He has
Scholar y
been
de la
awarded a
Fundación Alexander
Fulbright
von
Scholar
Humboldt, y es
and the
autor,
Alexander von
coeditor
Humboldt
de numerosos
Foundation
libros,
Awards. He's
artículos
the
y
author and co-editor of
publicaciones
numerous books and
especializadas,
articles in
de las cuales tu
specialized
exposición ha
publications and
dado
journals.
mucha cuenta.
So, and you have,
Así
of
que
course,
bueno,
attested to all of this through your
iniciaríamos
presentation. So
ahora el
with
momento de
that, we will
diálogo
be
con
opening
las
the
ideas
floor
que has puesto, nos
for
has
discussion
expuesto,
as of the ideas you've shared
y
with
me
us.
gustaría
And I would like
resaltar,
to
en primer
highlight,
lugar,
first of all,
este procedimiento, este método de
this
trabajo que
methodology
ofreces
of
acerca
work
de la
that you offer
ética,
and you share with
porque
regards to ethics,
normalmente
because normally
cae esta crítica de
this
formalismo vacío en la
criticism of
transmisión de la
empty
ética kantiana,
formalism falls on
y es
Kantian ethics,
justamente
and it is precisely
por la imposibilidad de
due to
conectar
the
con las otras
impossibility
obras
of
que salen
connecting
o que
with the other
rodean al
works
sistema crítico, como es la
that derive from
antropología, y
or
como
that
vos señalabas,
surround this
sabiendo que Kant dictó
anthropology,
antropología desde los
knowing that
comienzos, ¿no?,
Kant
de su
actually
actividad
was fond of
académica.
anthropology
Yo me
since
preguntaba
his
si este
initial steps in
formalismo
academia.
vacío ya en la
And
segunda
I was asking
formulación del
if in its
imperativo
second formula of the
no
imperative, that
estaría
empty
poniéndonos en
formalism
contacto con una
would not
ética
be
que sin
placing us
dejar
in
de ser
contact with an
formal
ethics that without it
parecería
being
indicar una
or ceasing to
dirección de
be formal
contenido, ¿no?
may
El otro
point
como
at a
fin
certain
en sí
content
mismo.
direction, in the
Digo, como
other
haciendo
as
frente
himself,
también desde,
as
desde lo que es la
facing
formulación del
or even
imperativo,
from the formula of
haciendo
the
frente a ese
imperative,
formalismo vacío.
also challenging that empty
Pero que
formalism.
recordaba también,
And what
digo
I
un par de
also
cosas que me
remembered,
que
and
me
I'm
quedé
just
pensando.
mentioning a couple of things that you actually triggered
Eso por un
as
lado,
of
cómo
your
integrar la
presentation. So
antropología
on the one
a
hand,
la
how to
investigación
integrate
crítica, que
anthropology
siempre
into
quedan por
critical
separado,
research that also seem to
como
be
si
on
fuera ilegítimo.
separate
La
paths, as if it
discusión
were
en el
illegitimate
Congreso
to
Kant
have the
respecto de ese
discussion
término
also
tuyo
at
de
the Kant
impura
Congress as
fue
of your
justamente
term
porque en
of
el sistema crítico
impure
no se puede
was
hablar de
precisely
impureza,
because in the critical system we cannot speak of
pero la ética
impurity.
kantiana no queda
But in the
reducida al
Kantian
sistema
ethics,
crítico.
it is not reduced to
En
this
fin,
system.
eso por un lado.
That on the one hand.
Después me quedé pensando mucho en los
And on the
conflictos
other, I was
internos
also
para la moral
thinking a
kantiana,
lot
los
about the
dilemas,
internal
que vos
conflicts or
señalaste muy bien en
dilemmas to
relación
the
a Ricoeur.
Kantian
Me
morality,
acordaba de
and
un
you
texto
mentioned with
que
regards to
es
Ricoeur.
muy común
And I
también para
remembered a
enfrentar
text that is
esto, que
quite
es
common to
el decir
approach
la
this, and
verdad
that
cuando un
is
amigo puede ser
saying the
asesinado. La
truth
discusión
when a
con
friend can
Benjamin
be
Constant.
murdered. The discussion with
Y
Benjamin
ahí todos
Constant,
dicen, no, Kant se
that
va
everyone says, no,
porque con ese
Kant
rigorismo vacío lo matan al
is
amigo,
that
etc.
empty rigor,
Entonces ahí
his
encontraba
friend is
otro
killed. So
que desde la forma en que vos lo exponés,
as of the
no es
way
la
that you
única
put
posibilidad
this,
de
it is not the
comprenderlo
only
como un
possibility of
formalismo vacío y
understanding this
cruel.
as an empty or cruel formalism.
Y después me preguntaba si,
And then
por
I
último
asked
lugar, para que vos
myself,
tomes lo que
lastly,
quieras,
sorry, and you take any of these comments or
¿cuál es el valor
questions to
del
answer, but
sentimiento en la
what is the
propuesta
value of
moral de Kant, a
feeling
tu
in the moral
juicio?
proposal of Kant?
Porque
I mean, in
pensaba
your
en la
perspective,
afinidad
because I
entre el
was
sentimiento
thinking
moral, el
about
sentimiento de lo
moral
sublime, el
feeling,
alma
the
bella.
feeling of the
O sea,
sublime, the
¿juega
beautiful
algún
soul, the beauty
rol
of
que
soul.
también
Is there any role
pudiéramos
there
pensar
that we
es
could also think
indispensable
of
en el
is really
desarrollo
irreplaceable
moral de
or
la
key
moralidad?
in the moral development?
Algunas reflexiones, nada más.
So,
Era-
any reflections, the one you would like to take on?
Okay, I'm not sure I got all of that. You raised several important issues. First, I have a note, pure versus impure. Yes, Kant is most famous for what he calls his pure philosophy. The Critique of Pure Reason is by far his most famous work. But nevertheless, in his ethical writings, he does stress that we also need empirical information along with these allegedly pure principles. You need both of them. And I read you, I think, 5 different quotations from different works where he states that explicitly. And frankly, even the Critique of Pure Reason has some passages in it where he acknowledges that although he himself is particularly interested in what he calls pure philosophy, that philosophy as a whole is bigger than this. He talks about empirical philosophy as also being part of philosophy. And he himself, in some of his natural science writings, it's not just in his moral writings that you get impurity. In some of his natural science writings, there's a fair amount of empirical content in physics and astronomy and cosmology. So yeah, this is an old chestnut that is frequently thrown at me. And I'm by no means trying to deny the importance of the Critique of Pure Reason, but there's more to Kant than that one book, okay? And I think it's for people who are really interested in Kant, they need to extend their reading to some of his other writings. Now let's see, then you had some comments about the second formula, which again is the one that Ricoeur favors. It's also the one that Alan Wood favors. And yes, I think part of the reason why at least some people favor that formula is that it does seem to give you more content. You do seem to get at least an illusion, if not a direct reference to human beings in there. So yeah, when I try to make sense out of Kant's ethics with students, I always find that the second formula has more success than the first. But I myself, I guess I would say I try to stick when possible with what Kant actually says. I'm a little more textually based than I think some philosophers are. And if you read his own remarks about these different formulas and how they relate to one another, he does say, and I quoted this also in my presentation, he does say that it's better to stick with the strict method and use the formula of universal law, as well as the second formula, as well as the third formula. I mean, of course, he thinks they're all different ways of saying the same thing. He's been challenged on that, but he thinks, yeah, they're all different ways of saying the same thing. So I take him seriously there, and I don't like to just lean on one formula to the exclusion of others. Then I have a note about lying, and particularly that notorious essay he wrote in response to Benjamin Constant on an alleged right to tell lies from benevolent motives. As you might imagine, that's not my favorite Kantian text. He does seem extremely rigid in there, but I do want to say, and this is part of my effort to get people to look outside some of the old standbys. In some of his classroom lectures on ethics, when he talks about truth-telling and whether it's ever morally permissible to lie, he does have a different position than what he advocates in the reply to Constant essay. In some of his classroom lectures on ethics, if I recall the Collins one, among others, he does say sometimes it is morally permissible to lie. There's a whole book of essays that was published in Germany on this topic years ago that has influenced me. But yeah, here too, I think if you go outside some of the standard texts, you do see a more realistic Kant. So I check out the Collins lecture. I don't know if that's been translated into Spanish or not, but we have an English translation. And just look in the index. In fact, if you're well, I don't know how much time we want to take with this. There are many entries, but the ones I have underlined in the index are on pages 426 and following. That's actually in the Vigilantius lecture. And then 201 to 05, which is probably the Collins. Yeah. And in this German book I referred to a minute ago, both of these texts are reprinted in there to offer evidence for a different reading of Kant's actual position on lying. All right, and then fourthly, I wrote down feeling, and does it have any positive role to play in ethics on Kant's view? And here, I think it'd be best for me to just mention Maria Borges's work in Brazil. Some of you maybe are familiar with her writing. She's done some very good work on this topic. But yes, although if you only read the groundwork, you're not going to see this. There's one notorious passage in the groundwork where Kant says it's the wish of every rational being to be free of inclinations. You know, if I had my druthers, I would just prefer to be a creature without any inclination. But in other works, such as the Metaphysics of Morals, he speaks much more positively about feeling and emotion playing a positive role in ethics. He says, among other things, sympathetic feeling is a duty. Cheerfulness is a duty. Now, I don't want to go overboard here. I mean, it wouldn't be Kant if you didn't also factor in his core position, which is that, you know, we're mixed creatures. We have both the capacity to reason, but we also have inclinations and desires and feelings. And reason needs to be in charge. If you put feeling in charge, you're not really going to have a Kantian ethics. But I would say it's definitely the case that feeling of the appropriate sort plays an important secondary role in the moral life, according to Kant. Okay. I hope I've responded to your question.
Muchísimas gracias, perfecto. Interesante.
Thank you very
Bueno,
much. Great. Very
Abrimos
interesting.
entonces la conversación. Si alguien del público
So now
a su
the
vez
floor is
se sintió
open.
tocado
If
por alguna
anybody from the
cuestión y quiere
audience
intervenir,
would like to
con
make any
toda
comments or
libertad,
questions, feel
podemos
free.
seguir
We
conversando.
can continue this dialogue. The floor is open.
Porque es muy rico este juego, esta articulación
This is
entre
a very
la
rich
moral
presentation,
formal
and this
y
comparison between
justamente toda
formal
esta realización
morality
empírica,
and this
práctica,
empirical practical
que es más
realization,
compleja de ver en Kant.
which is more complex.
Bueno, sí, mientras esperamos otra intervención,
While we
yo
wait for
pensaba en el rol
other
de la facultad de
questions, I
juzgar,
was
de la
thinking
Urteilskraft,
about
¿no?
the
Porque
Urteilskraft,
la
the ability
reflexionante,
to
si tiene
judge
algún papel en la moral,
reflection. Does it
porque
play any
justo la
role
facultad
in
de juzgar,
morality?
diríamos,
Urteilskraft
puede juzgar
may
siguiendo una ley, pero hay un momento
judge
en
by
el cual
following a law, but there is a moment when,
busca para ese caso singular
for that case in
un
particular,
universal que no está
they look
presente,
for
que lo tiene que
something
encontrar.
universal that is not present
Entonces me
there, that
parecía
has to be
que,
found.
no sé qué pensás vos, que la facultad
I
de
don't know what
juzgar
you
en este
think,
momento
but the
reflexionante
power to
también juega un
judge at
papel
that point
en
also
la
plays
moralidad, que no
an
es
important role
simplemente está
in
la ley, sé lo
morality.
que
It is
hago.
not
Creo que vos lo
that
dijiste
law is
desde el
there
lado
and
del
I know what to
conflicto.
do. That's what you said from the part of conflict.
Well, I did argue in my presentation that yes, on Kant's view, moral judgment is needed in ethics. But I suppose that is a somewhat controversial or contested position. I tried to back it up with a number of quotations from Kant where he says in different ways, judgment is needed in ethics. Now, again, Ricoeur, this is one issue that we disagree on. We both think judgment is necessary in the moral life, but Ricoeur feels compelled to go outside of Kant's ethics to Aristotle and his theory of phronesis at this point. Whereas I argue that you can, and you should, stick with Kant on this topic because his theory of Urteilskraft is very close to Aristotle's theory of phronesis. Now, I had a footnote here that may or may not add something to the debate. Some of you, no doubt, are familiar with Hannah Arendt's philosophy, a German woman who came over to the United States at the end of World War II. She's quite interested in the topic of judgment. She had planned to make the third and final volume of her Life of the Mind, a volume called Judging, and she didn't live to write it. But we do have a book called Lectures on Kant's Political Philosophy. And, you know, on the one hand, I was excited because I thought, oh, well, here's someone who is on my side on this topic, but I don't think she really is. What I have in the footnote here is Arendt's extant remarks on Kant's theory of judgment are sometimes idiosyncratic and not always faithful to Kant. For instance, she is definitely in error when she writes, quote, judgment of the particular has no place in Kant's moral philosophy. And I don't think that is correct. She's, I guess, primarily interested in the role of judgment in the political life of humans rather than in the moral life. But why you would need judgment in one of those areas but not the other is a mystery to me. Listen, again, I know it's hard to follow philosophy lectures in a language that you're not fluent in. I have had to do so on many occasions in my travels over the years. So don't worry about that.
Bien, muchísimas gracias. No sé si alguien más
Thank you so much. I don't know if we have any other comments
alguna reflexión
or
alguna
questions
pregunta al profesor ahora que lo tenemos.
for Professor Louden now that we have him with us. I had a question. I'd like to ask a question about Professor Louden's works. If, it's not about this conference, but about Professor Louden's work. Can I ask you a question? First of all, I'm from Colombia, and I was invited by the Kantian Studies in Spanish Language Society, and I want to thank Professor Louden. It is a pleasure and honor for me to see you even virtually, because I've been inspired by your work. So I thank you for your work, Professor Louden. There is an article that you published a book in Germany about Reflection 903 of Kant on transcendental anthropology, where Professor Louden states that Kant's anthropology is mostly empirical. But that word mostly leads us to think that there is something of transcendental anthropology. So I wanted to ask Professor Louden, do you consider there is something that we might call transcendental anthropology in Kant? I think that you relate it to cosmopolitanism, but it might also lean towards the concept of Stimmung, determination.
Bestimmung, yeah. Bestimmung.
Bestimmung, that takes people to progress. And I wanted to ask about that study that you made. It is mostly empirical, but we can say that even if it's a little, there is a little transcendental anthropology in Kant. Can we say that?
Yes, I think so. What I meant by the mostly was mostly, but not entirely. I mean, the most obvious dimensions or areas of Kant's anthropology, which seem to me to be clearly non-empirical, are, well, the teleological dimension. You mentioned the crucial term Bestimmung a moment ago. And Kant, he talks a lot about teleology in his third critique. And one of the claims he makes there is that this is not an empirical concept. So yeah, the heavy teleological dimension of Kant's anthropology is one part that's non-empirical, therefore transcendental. And then a second obvious part would be the moral dimension of it. Now here too, there's a strife, an ongoing battle between different Kant scholars. Some, I guess, particularly Reinhard Brandt in Germany, argue that there is no moral anthropology in Kant's anthropology. But ironically, his younger colleague, Werner Stark, thinks that there is. And on this point, I'm with Werner. We were actually both at a conference in Frankfurt, Germany last month, and we had a chance to reacquaint ourselves with each other. You know, I'm not, however, a defender of Kant's more ambitious claim that is related to that transcendental anthropology passage in one of the Reflexionen, where Kant says, in the Logic as well as in some other places, that the question, what is the human being, is the most fundamental and important question in philosophy, and that all of philosophy's questions in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, practical philosophy, they will all be answered if and when we successfully answer the question, was ist der Mensch? What's the human being? And this is because, well, it's partly because of what I call Kant's extraterrestrial convictions. You know, he thinks there are definitely other rational beings elsewhere in the universe. This belief isn't as popular with intellectuals as it used to be. In the 18th century, I would say the majority of serious thinkers subscribed to it in Europe. And today that's not the case. But, you know, suppose there are rational beings on Saturn, which Kant, in his early work, what is it, the universal theory of the heavens or something, asserted that there were. For them, getting an answer to the question, what is the human being, is not going to help them with their philosophical queries, because they're not humans. And the more general point, I think, is that philosophy is bigger than the human. I mean, I personally am rather skeptical that we are going to find intelligent life elsewhere. Governments and now billionaires such as Elon Musk and so forth are doling out a ton of money to try to make contact. And I'm not sure we might be alone. I don't see any evidence yet that there are other intelligent creatures out there, but it's possible. And if there were, I think they too would engage in philosophy. And I don't think for them answering the question, what is the human being, is going to answer all their philosophical questions. So, yeah, I've written several pieces on this, but yeah, I'm not a fan of the claim that there's a transcendental anthropology with a capital T. The only time Kant uses that term is once in that one Reflexion, which of course is not a published piece of work. Well, it was not published until long after he died. But I do wholeheartedly agree with the somewhat more modest claim that Kantian anthropology is not merely empirical. There's more to it than that.
Muchas gracias, profesor.
Yeah, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay. Whew. Okay.
Hay una pregunta en el chat.
There is a question in the chat.
Si alguien quiere leerlo, si querés
Okay, I haven't.
Anybody
all
would like
kinds
to
of
read it?
I haven't looked in there because I'm afraid I'll lose the picture on my screen of you and so forth. But feel free to read it if you think it's something we should talk about.
Perfecto. Perfecto. ¿Podés leerla entonces? No sé quién está hablando.
I can read it.
¿Alguna de las
It struck
intérpretes?
me when I learned
Yeah.
that Kant was pro-death penalty when he upheld human life as a major value.
Yeah.
How do you view his position?
Well, this is another notorious issue in Kant, and particularly for those of us who are trying to make Kant a more humanistic thinker, his strong advocacy and defense of the death penalty is saddening. I will say that part of his retributivist theory of punishment does hold that you are only legally and morally permitted to punish someone if he or she has been shown to be guilty. Proof of guilt is necessary. And at least here in the United States, a lot of the recent opposition to the death penalty has arisen because it has turned out that a number of people on what we call death row awaiting execution, and some who themselves have been executed by the state, have been shown scientifically through DNA testing that they were not in fact guilty. So that doesn't erase Kant's endorsement of the death penalty, but I am sure he would agree that it has been used in many cases where it should not have been used because guilt has not been proven. Okay. But yes, that's not one of my favorite parts of Kant's practical philosophy. There's, I don't know how much work you've done on this, but he has a notorious passage in the Metaphysics of Morals where he says, if a society was disbanding, before they did so, they had to make sure that the very last murderer was executed. Otherwise, there would be, what's he call it, too much blood stain. I'm not sure that's the exact phrase, but they would still have too much guilt on their hand. You have to execute the last murderer. And that seems particularly extreme to my ears.
Ya.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Jenny Becerra, sí, adelante.
Thank you very much.
Jenny, ¿querías seguir participando con algún
Jenny,
comentario?
did you have
No,
another
I just wanted
comment?
to thank you. It's because it's not only because of the people who might be innocent, but just the fact that he defended life so much,
Bueno,
like human life above everything else, and then the death penalty.
Well, if I hear you, and I should have stuck this in sooner, I mean, some people also argue that Kant's defense of the death penalty itself is not consistent with his overall practical philosophy, because what happens to the irreplaceable value and worth of the human being once he or she is executed? It's gone. So I know some people try to argue that if you read Kant correctly, he should have not have advocated the death penalty. But here too, because of my fondness for texts and being a more literally oriented scholar in philosophy, I can't dismiss his strong statements in defense of the death penalty. He does say that many times.
Thank you.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you
No
so
sé si
much.
alguien más quiere
Are
intervenir,
there any
comentar o
further
preguntar.
questions or comments?
Yo quería decirles que es
I just wanted to
la
tell
última
you
exposición,
that
o sea,
today
Robert
is the
Louden
last
cierra este ciclo
lecture.
de
Professor
conferencias que
Louden is
comenzó
closing
en el
this
mes de
cycle of
mayo.
conferences that started in May.
Hubo muchos
We had
representantes
many
de la filosofía de
representatives
Kant, entre ellos,
from Kant's
bueno,
philosophy,
Ubirajara Rancán, de Acevedo
such as
Márquez,
Ubirajara Rancán,
Ribeiro dos Santos,
Ribeiro
Gustavo
dos
Leiva,
Santos, Gustavo Leiva,
también María Jesús Vázquez, Nuria
María
Sánchez.
Jesús
O sea, tuvimos
Vázquez,
toda una
Nuria
serie de
Sánchez. We had a
expositores,
series of
también
speakers
Alejandro Vigo y
and
Aramayo,
lecturers,
Roberto Aramayo, que
Alejandro
abrieron el
Vigo,
ciclo,
Roberto
y con tu
Aramayo, who opened
conferencia,
the cycle,
Robert, te
and your
agradezco
conference,
muchísimo,
Robert, is
cerramos este ciclo.
closing
Se
this
completa
cycle.
por este año, se cierra
We
este
have
ciclo,
completed
y
it
la
for
verdad
the
que un
year,
lujo,
and it's a real
realmente
luxury
tenerte y
to
haberte
have you
escuchado y haber
close
podido
this cycle with your
conversar con vos.
lecture.
That gave me a little more time to prepare my talk too, so I was happy for that. Okay, muchas gracias. Estoy cansado.
La dedicación.
Thank you for your dedication.
Silvia, would it be possible for you not to shut this all down? Because I see there are 20 chat messages. I'd like to maybe take a look at those if possible. And I'm worried that they're going to disappear if you,
Sí.
if it's, I mean, everyone else is welcome to leave, but if possible, I'd like to just take a look at those chat messages. I was afraid to click because I'm sure your picture would have disappeared.
Sí.
Yo, si quieren los vamos leyendo, los leo muy pausados.
If you want, I can read them
Aquellos que
slowly.
no leímos
Well,
we can read those that we haven't read.
Yeah.
Los primeros.
I can read the first ones.
Okay.
El CV.
I'm not sure they would all be of interest to the audience, but use your own judgment. Use your own Urteilskraft there, okay?
No, Y después, no, tenemos un rato y compartimos, o si también quizá alguien que no los haya podido leer, también los puede, claro, los puede escuchar. Tenemos
We have
un chat que pregunta si
one
esta
chat
conferencia se va a
where they
grabar,
ask
va a quedar
whether
en el
this
canal de
conference will
YouTube,
be recorded
a lo
for
cual
the YouTube
contestamos que
channel,
sí, que en
and
unos
we
pocos
answered
días
it
ya,
will, and in a
entrando a
few
nuestra
days,
página del Centro
if they
de Estudios
go
de Hermenéutica,
into
ahí van a poder
our
encontrar de
Hermeneutic
vuelta
Center
esta
website,
conferencia
they
grabada.
will be able to find
Luego
this recorded
tenemos
conference.
un agradecimiento.
On
Then there
YouTube.
is
Yes.
Okay, bueno. If you could send me even the link or the
Sí.
update, because some of my colleagues might want to see it. Sure.
Sí. En cuanto esté la grabación
as soon as we have the recording edited and uploaded, we always send our speakers, you and Silvia and everybody else, we will send you the links so that you can share this with you. It's free of charge. You can share it is a good way to share what you shared with us.
Okay.
Then we have the chat that was just read and you answered about death penalty. And then we have Gilberto Brites thanking us for thanking you for your lecture. And he apologizes because he has to go deliver a lecture. Then Ana Almeida also thanking these meetings. Jenny Becerra thanking as well. And Adolfo thanking the organizers and lecturers that participated in this good idea.
Y entonces, yo también quiero agradecer,
I would also like to
para agradecerte, Silvia,
thank you, Silvia,
que has dedicado
for your hard work
a este ciclo. Mencionar también
devoted to this cycle. I'd like to mention as well that when you go to the YouTube channel, you will be able to see the presentation of the round table where Claudia Jauregui and Silvia participated as part of this cycle. It was a very interesting modality to work as a round table. You will find each of these 9 lectures and this luxury closure with Professor Louden's lecture. There is one more comment in the chat. Juan José Linsalata, he is one of the participants, a very frequent participant in our presentations. He says it was very interesting.
Thanks a lot to the Professor Louden and congratulations to him for his presentation.
Muy bien. Ese ha sido el último comentario.
Well, that was the last comment in the chat.
Okay. Muy bien. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Robert, for being so specific and for taking the work to focus Kantian ethics in relation to one of the most discussed authors in hermeneutics. That is to say, thanks for locating your position in this area. We appreciate your effort and we want to thank you because it shows how seriously you took it and how smart you are. Thank you so much.